All right, so now that we know what to do with 4 and 7 in our progression, we can sort of start to get a pretty good picture of the network of chords that we're going to have. You know, adding 2 chords on the predominant spot and the dominant functional spot, that adds a little bit of decision making that we have to have and some critical thinking there. But even still, it can look like a fairly linear kind of thing. Go from 3 to 6 to either 4 or 2 to either 7 or 5 to 1. You know, it still has that same kind of linear aspect. You know, if we're here in C, right? You know, if we're still working with that, we got 3 to 6, and then either 4 or 2, 7 or 5, 1. It's still moving very, very much in the same direction, and there's a real predictable element to it. And still, we also know that the reason we put 4 with 2 and 7 with 5 is because they share 2 common tones. And so if I'm here and I go from 6 to 2, that doesn't have really a super huge difference between going from 6 to 4. A lot of the times, the same melody, for instance, could go with both. And the same would be true of going from 4 to 5 and going from 4 to 7. A little bit different because of the diminished nature of 7, but you get the point. There are a lot of similarities there. So even though we've added some elements that we can use to diversify the predominant and dominant area, there is still a lot of connection with that straight, linear circle of fifths progression. So what we want to do is talk about some common ways that we do it differently, some common exceptions to the chart. So this is sort of what we've started with here. This is the chart that we've built up, which involves, you know, that real linear 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1 motion. And if I just switch one of them out, like let's say I switch 2 for 4, it still has the same essence. Here's 3 to 6 to 4 to 5 to 1. It's not that different. So let's talk about some of the ways that we sort of avoid the aspects of that straight linear nature of this chart. The first thing that I want to mention, just as a reminder, is, of course, that 1 can go anywhere. So that automatically adds a little bit of, interest to the progression here, because where 1 jumps back to will have a big impact on how the progression feels, right? If the 1 chord, again, I'm in C, I'm going to change keys pretty soon here, but if the 1 chord jumps all the way back to the 3 chord, we've got a long progression ahead of us. Especially imagine if instead of doing just 1 predominant and 1 dominant chord, if we used both. Going from 1 to 3 would now give us 3, 6, 4, 2, 7, 5, 1. That's a lot of chords. And again, always think back to, what if each of these chords lasted for a measure? That's ridiculous. That would be this long progression. Here comes 4, 2, 7. You better have a lot to say in that progression. So that's important, but it would change, obviously, dramatically if 1 instead jumped back to 2. 2 is really close to the cadence. So that sort of element of the place you begin with 1's flexibility to go anywhere has a big impact. But we want even more ways to disrupt the progression chart. So let's do it. Now, we actually already know about one of the, by far, the most common exception to this chart. We've already worked on this. And so let's think. We talked about it in part writing, and we said that this was sort of one of the first ways that we get some discussion of function in with our part writing. And it had to do with the 5 chord, right? So if we're going through the progression here, here's what I'm going to change keys. So I'm going to be in G. So if I'm in G major and I'm back on 3, I'm gearing up for a long progression. Here comes 6, here comes 2, now here comes 5. What if I'm not ready to go to 1? If I'm on 5, what if I don't want to go to 1? Where else could I go? I could go to 6, right? Remember, 5 to 6. We had a special name for that. And the special name we gave the motion from 5 to 6 was that it's deceptive. And it's deceptive because we sort of are hearing, we expect 5 to go to 1, right? That's its whole clear purpose in life. And so it's deceptive if instead of going to 1, 5 goes to 6, right? It avoids ending the progression. And so now our progression, which has been entirely based on moving left to right, getting to 1, finishing the job there, finishing the progression, it's been disrupted because now we are back fairly early in the progression. We have a lot of work to do to get now from 6, trying again to achieve this sort of, conclusion of our progression. So deceptive motion is 5 to 6, and we're again sort of using this common tone connection to think of these things because 6, if I'm in G, 6 is E, G, B. So again, we've got these 2 common tones with 1. That whole 2 common tone thing is really critical. That's how we ended up with 4 and 2 matched up. That's how we ended up with 7 and 5 matched up. And that's part of what makes 6 act like a really effective tonic substitute, right? 5, the dominant chord, wants to go to 1, the tonic. And so 5, instead of going to the real tonic, it goes to a substitute tonic. You're not my tonic anymore. Can't tell me what to do. I'm going to 6, right? So we're sort of moving along. We're substituting a chord that has 2 common tones in this deceptive motion. So that's really useful. And again, this all comes back to that idea of we want a progression technique that will keep the forward momentum because we're trying to build harmony that is based around a place to go, but we don't want it to be this only moving in one direction, constantly getting to 1, constantly finishing the progression. That doesn't make for very satisfying music if it's always resolving. We want there to be a little bit of disruption, and we want the progression to have a lot of variation in it. So not getting to 1 is really important. Before we talk about more exceptions, I want to make one critical point here, which is that notice the arrow is specifically going from 5 to 6. It is not going from 7 to 6 because 7 does not want to go to 6 in the same way. It's not deceptive motion. And part of that is because, remember, 7 is a much weaker harmony than 5. And so 7 going to 1 doesn't have nearly the conclusion and the finality. Here's 7 to 1 versus 5 to 1. Has a much stronger sound than this sort of 7 to 1 thing. And so we don't need as much of a way to avoid that because it doesn't have the same effect of conclusion that 5 to 1 does. So deceptive motion is 5 to 6, not any dominant chord to 6. So try to run with that a little bit. Okay, so that's deceptive motion. Let's talk about our next common exception to this chart. This one is another sound that we probably are fairly familiar with, and it involves the 4 chord. And in fact, it has the 4 chord going to 1. So instead of using either of our dominant harmonies, 7 or 5, 4 can just go straight to 1. It's really great. And this actually has a name. Does anybody know the name of that? We call this Plagal Motion. Sort of a fun, very unique word, Plagal. And so you're probably very familiar with the sound of Plagal Motion because we sometimes call this the Amen sound, right? You got that? 4 to 1. 4 to 1 is really, really effective in a piece of music, just in the same way that we were talking about 7 going to 1 is much weaker than 5 going to 1. And so, similarly, 4 is even more weak than 7 functionally, which means if 4 goes to 1, we will not really hear it as the end, right? So if I'm in a progression, here comes my 6 chord, here comes my 4 chord, here comes 1. Hear how I haven't done 5 to 1, and so it's not over. 5 to 1 is the ending. But if I avoid that dominant tonic resolution, 4 to 1 gets me to a very important chord. It gets me to 1. And 1 is important for a lot of reasons, but progression-wise, 1 is critical because where can 1 go? Anywhere. 1 is absolutely free to go to any chord it wants to because it's the home key. It's the tonic. So if 1 wants to go to 3, by all means, have at it, right? So being able to get to 1 from 4 is really great because 1 then is free to move the progression in any way that it likes. And we can do that without either of the dominant chords. We don't need 5, and we even don't need the weaker dominant 7 to go to 1. So Plagal Motion is really, really amazing. And so you can see that we've got this network now with these exceptions of ways to keep a progression alive, either by avoiding the dominant tonic relationship, 5 can just move to 6, or by avoiding the strength of a dominant relationship by just having 4 go to 1, which can then in turn go anywhere. Right? And we can sort of hear this because if I'm here and let's do Deceptive Motion, here's 5. Deceptive Motion to 6. Right? Now here comes 4. And here 4 going to 1 is nice and weak. Then I can build it up and get 5 to 1, which is very resolute, very strong. So by avoiding the strength of the dominant to tonic resolution a couple times, first by going 5 to 6, then by going 4 to 1, when I do actually resolve 5 to 1, it's a very, very satisfying, very fulfilling ending to the progression. So it helps to reinvigorate the strong relationships that are already built into this progression by having ways to avoid them, right? That's an important idea. Okay, so we've done Deceptive Motion, which is 5 to 6, and we've done Plagal Motion, which is 4 to 1. And in both of these cases, it was really important that the arrows were written where they are. So 5 to 6 is only this dominant chord. It's only 5 to 6. And Plagal Motion is only this predominant chord, 4 to 1. 4 moves to 1 much more openly than 2 would move to 1. And remember, that sort of comes back to this idea of why do we label or why do we write this chart in this manner? We put 2 on the bottom because it's the stronger of the predominant chords. 2 has that circle of fifths motion to 5, right? If I'm in G, right, I could go A, G, F sharp, E, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So A can go down 5 to 5. That circle of fifths motion, really important. Well, in a backwards kind of way, how far away from 1 is 4? If if I go downwards, it's 4, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. But what if I go upwards? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 4 is also kind of a fifth away from 1, but moving in the other direction. So it has that integrity of motion. And that's why we can go from 4 to 1 in a convincing Plagal manner, but 2 doesn't really want to go to 1, because even though 2 is closer to 1 in terms of 1, 2, right? 1 or 2, 1. 2 has a much stronger pull to 5 because of the circle of fifths relationship. It's the fifth that really has the sort of gravity pull in a progression. So 2 wants to go to 5, and that's why we don't really use 2 to go to 1, whereas the other predominant chord, 4, can go to 1 very easily because of that Plagal motion, which is kind of an inverted fifth. So it has that secret hidden fifths relationship with 1, which is nice to exploit. Okay, so we have deceptive motion, we have Plagal motion. Both of these exceptions have fun and important names to them. We're going to look at one more exception, and I'm going to let the name of it let you get a sense for how important it is compared to deceptive motion and Plagal motion. So here's our last exception. It goes from the 3 chord to the 4 chord. So way out here in outer space to the 4 chord. And the name of this progression is least common. So this is clearly not as important, but it's still really critical because it allows the 3 chord to be pretty flexible instead of only being able to go to 6, right? And if we really if we combine least common with Plagal motion, 3 can get to 1 in 2 chords, right? So what was once the outer limits of our solar system here, 3 can actually get to 1 pretty quickly and nice and weakly, which is great because that keeps our progression alive if we use slightly weaker harmonies. So, okay, so let's get a feel for this. So here comes a 3 chord, right? So 3 usually wants to go to 6, and that keeps that circle of fifths relationship alive. But 3 can also go to 4, and 4 can go to 1. Or 3 to 4 to 5. I wouldn't recommend that progression, but it's just a little, it's a little steppy. The 3 to 4 progression, we hear that a lot. And in fact, if I go from G or from 1, which is a G chord, to 3 to 4 to 1, that's the very famous, the puff the magic dragon, live by the sea, right? So we hear that progression 1, 3, 4, 1 all the time. It's a really right, and then we got what happens here? That's not what we're here to talk about, but why not talk about Puff the Magic Dragon? So 3 to 4, least common, we could call it the Puff the Magic Dragon progression, but it's much less important. There's a lot less to talk about with it, but it's a really nice way to keep some flexibility with 3 as opposed to only having one place to go. So at this point, we have a lot of openness for all of these chords. 1 is the most open because it can go anywhere, and every other chord now has at least 2 other places it can go, except for 1 chord. And that one unique chord that only has 1 place that it goes is 7. 7 is the only one of these chords that can only go to 1 place, and it's the 1 chord. I suppose we could have 7 do a big circle of fifths relationship to 3, but that wasn't really great. All the other chords, 6 can easily move to 4 or 2. 2 can easily move to 7 or 5, right? 4 can go 3 places. 4 can go to 7, 4 can go to 2, 4 can go to 1. A lot of options there. So we have this sort of immensely diverse and wide option sort of palette in front of us now once we add in just these 3 common exceptions to what's going on. Deceptive motion is by far the most important. Plagal motion, really critical. The ability to not use a dominant chord but still get to 1, really important. And then 3 to 4 can be really helpful as well. The last thing I want to say about these is we already pointed out the fact that these arrows are very clear or specific on which of the chords in these pairs actually is involved. So deceptive motion is 5 to 6, not 7 to 6. Plagal motion is 4 to 1, not 2 to 1, right? The other thing, the last thing I want to point out with these is that they are one direction. So let's say plagal motion, let's do deceptive motion, is the 5 chord going to the 6 chord, not the 6 chord going to the 5 chord. There's nothing deceptive about that, right? 6 doesn't have that much functional strength to it. So 6 going to 5 doesn't have that same power as 5 going to 6. That's a disruption. That's a surprise, right? 3 going to 4 is a nice way of skipping over this 6 chord and immediately moving into a functional area. 4 doesn't go to 3. 4 doesn't need to go that direction. So all of these arrows are one direction, right? So keep that in mind. But these are our common exceptions. So you want to feel really comfortable with this chart and have a very, very, very quick knowledge of which chords go where. And so I would practice writing this chart, get the arrows on there, and keep your exceptions in mind. Deceptive motion, plagal motion, and the motion from 3 to 4, the Puff the Magic Dragon progression. So that's our progression chart. Now let's keep on using it. We're also going to look at it in minor, which is always an exciting thing to add.